Good afternoon, everybody. This is Matt Hochstein with Hagerty Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the NEMA webinar entitled Leveraging Non-FEMA Disaster Grant Programs. So thank you for joining us today, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Deborah Siefert. Deb is the director with Hagerty Consulting's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Programs. She has over 15 years experience managing CDBG programs, with the last 10 exclusively working in CDBG-DR. She is recognized and respected as a subject matter expert in the field. Deb is currently on site acting as the project manager for both the City of Longmont and the Boulder County Collaborative in Colorado. There she assists the city to administer more than $60 million of CDBG-DR flood recovery funds countywide. Prior to assisting Colorado, she assisted the City of New York's Office of Management and Budget with program startup to administer the city's $4.2 billion Sandy Disaster Recovery CDBG funds. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Deb, and she will guide us through today's presentation. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, I'm Deborah Siefert with Hagerty Consulting. I want to start by saying that it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you about a very important disaster recovery funding. Community Development Block Grant for Disaster Recovery, CDBG-DR, is an important source in the recovery life cycle. It's my goal that by the end of this session, you have a good sense of how it works and ways that you can leverage these funds with FEMA and other federal sources. So let's get started with Leveraging Non-Federal Disaster Grant Programs presentation. So why use CDBG-DR funds? Because I'm sure that you've heard they are complex and they're a bit tricky. But what's very important to remember is that they're one of the most, if not the most flexible of federal disaster grant funds. If you look to the right, you'll see that there's many sectors that these funds can be used in: housing, economic revitalization, infrastructure, resiliency, public services, planning, and that's even becoming more important as we see in the disaster world. So when you would see this flexibility in these different sectors that can be addressed, your communities have more opportunity to design and run programs that meet their specific recovery needs. There's a wide range of eligible recovery activities. As I said, they fall under housing, infrastructure, resilience, and these can be targeted for your long-term recovery. So what types of projects are eligible for CDBG-DR funding? Well, the basic criteria for the funding eligibility starts with a tie back to the disaster. So you need to be able to show and document a direct impact from the damages from the declared disaster event or indirect impact. And there are some ways of doing that, such as if power went out and businesses, lost stock, and there were impacts from that indirect source. And then again, you have the different categories of eligible activities. There's housing, economic development, infrastructure, public services, and planning. What's important with the CDBG-DR, even with all of this flexibility, HUD has a very strict requirement that you have to meet one of their 3 national objectives. The key national objective is the low mod, and there's different ways of meeting that through area benefits, direct benefits, and housing and jobs. The other national objective is the slum blight, and then the third is urgent need. And only since CDBG started being used more in the disaster recovery realm has that urgent need national objective been utilized. I want to go over some of the basic steps for how the CDBG-DR, the disaster recovery funds, are awarded. So after the disaster, Congress has to make an allocation, and they do that based on an estimated unmet need. HUD will then publish in a Federal Register notice the requirements to actually access those funds. The notice typically contains some immediate deadlines that will start the day the notice becomes effective, and those are 60 and 90-day deadlines. They require submissions of certifications for financial controls, capacity and risk assessment, and some pre-award implementation plans. The notice will provide also specific requirements for completing an unmet needs assessment and an action plan, and those will need to be typically submitted to HUD within 90 days of publication. So CDBG itself has been around for a long time, over 40 years. And there are a whole foundation of procedures and requirements that still apply when the CDBG funds are used for disaster recovery. If you look here at the pyramid, the foundation is the regular CDBG program regulations, and those can be found at 24 CFR 570. So everything in the 24 CFR 570 applies to the DR unless it's been waived or modified. And that's what you'll see in that disaster Federal Register notice. Then once you do your action plan based on your unmet needs assessment, whatever programs and activities you put in that action plan, you have to comply with that. So you have to be cognizant that if you start to do a project that was not in your action plan, you have to make amendments through HUD before those projects are eligible. Then once you write your own program policies and procedures, HUD will monitor you to make sure that you are complying with your program policies and procedures. And then they'll also look to any local laws and state laws that could impact your program. So you have this whole entire, pyramid here of compliance requirements. And then there's also the need to meet the federal cross-cutting requirements, such as OMB's common rule under the new 2 CFR 200. Prior to that, that was HUD's uniform administrative requirements found at 24 CFR Part 84 and 85. You'll still need to comply with all the NEPA and environmental requirements, and because HUD has their own set of environmental regulations, you have to make sure that your NEPA reports comply with HUD requirements. There's federal labor standards for Davis-Bacon. Section 3, federal housing and equal opportunity always has to be adhered to. Uniform Relocation Act, lead-based paint. So there's a lot to do with compliance, and knowing that up front and building that into your programs is key. So let's talk about some of the CDBG modifications under disaster. As we're saying, when the Federal Register comes out, it provides some waivers and modifications to the regular standard CDBG. You'll see on the left side of the screen that this is the basic elements of CDBG is that they do have a broad scope. You have the eligible activities of housing, infrastructure, economic development. All your eligible activities must meet a national objective, the low mod, slum blight, or urgent need. With regular CDBG, there is a very hard requirement that all the funds that you are allocated, 70% of those will need to be shown to either benefit on an area basis or individual basis a low mod activity. Regular CDBG requires an annual action plan. That's where you have to say up front, here's what we see need in our community, and here's how we're going to spend our CDBG dollars for housing or parks or whatever you're using it for in your community. You have to show that you're meeting all the cross-cutting federal requirements, the NEPA, the labor standards, all required under regular CDBG. You have to be able to verify who you benefited, and that has to be documented. And if you are an entitlement community, because CDBG comes out in either a state allocation or to what they call an entitlement community, which are usually cities over 50,000, then you have direct oversight from HUD. So under the CDBG-DR, that changes up a bit. You can still do all the same broad scope of activities, but you need to be able to tie those activities back to your disaster impact. And again, those can be direct or indirect, but you still need to be able to document that. Under the Federal Register, they make it easier to meet the urgent need national objective. Under regular CDBG, that's rarely used because that's a high bar, but under disaster, it would make sense that urgent need would be a little more easy to access. Starting back with Katrina, they lowered the requirement to meet your percentage of low mod expenditures to 50%. And that has been on every disaster up until the last 2 Federal Register notices. And I just want to note that it was moved back to 70%. I don't know what to expect on future ones. I'm sure we'll see if that's getting them where they want in their objectives or if it's making it harder to implement these programs. But But always look to see if you do get that modification down to a 50% low mod expenditure, and that's an easier bar, obviously, than trying to meet a 70%. But I just want to note that the last two Federal Registers did have it at 70%, so look to that. For your action plan, it's the same thing, but you do have to go the extra step of doing the unmet needs assessment and making sure that how you want to spend your funds ties back proportionally to your damaged sectors. For example, if you're showing that you had 60% of your unmet need in housing, then HUD would want to see 60% of your funds going to housing or some type of housing activity or some activity that's supporting your housing. So again, it's very flexible, but you do have to tie it back to the disaster and to, you know, the unmet need and the impact sectors. Your verification is extremely important with the CDBG-DR, just like it is with the CDBG. You need to make sure that it's well documented, who you benefited, how they qualified to receive those benefits, that you followed it all the way through, that they got what they were supposed to get, that the project's completed. But there's an extra step with CDBG-DR, and you also have to document that any assistance you're providing is not duplicating other assistance, whether it's FEMA IA, FEMA PA, SBA, even private insurance or charity funds coming in. All of that has to be looked at for whether or not it's duplicating the assistance that you're providing. And then the same thing as far as entitlements. They're under the CDBG-DR. If you're an entitlement community and you get an annual allocation from HUD, you cannot assume that you will get your CDBG-DR as a direct allocation. HUD sometimes, most of the time, sends all the money to the state, and then the state runs it and then sub-allocates it to entitlement communities and other communities. And in that case, then you do not have a direct relationship to HUD. You do have to work through your state. But there are instances where HUD does give the entitlement communities a direct CDBG-DR allocation. And that's always a good, that's good for those communities because they've already got that relationship with HUD, they know how to handle the grant, and it takes the burden off the state that they're not having to oversee a community that can, you know, has the ability to implement these funds themselves. So that's always important to know. But if you are an entitlement and you did not get a direct allocation of DR funds, then you will need to work with your state for how those funds are to be used. So we'll talk a little bit about FEMA PA programs and how they are different from the CDBG-DR, but also how they're complementary. So for FEMA PA, the funding usually is going to your infrastructure and public facilities, and you pretty much have to repair them back to the condition they were pre-disaster. With FEMA, your compliance requirements are different from CDBG-DR, and you have to look to those differences because if you're anticipating using CDBG-DR down the road, you'll need to show that you are complying with those additional requirements from the beginning. For example, if you're doing a road, you have to use Davis Bacon for it to be eligible for CDBG-DR. There's some minor caveats to that, but just overall, keep in mind that if you've not done Davis Bacon, it's very unlikely that the DR will be able to match that project. Of course, FEMA PA is designed and administered directly by FEMA. FEMA does not pay 100% of the costs generally. They do make exceptions sometimes, but the rule of thumb is that 75% of the eligible costs will be covered by FEMA. The other 25% needs to be paid from non-FEMA funds and match that. And your costs must be approved by FEMA before you're reimbursed. In CDBG, the funding can be used not only to repair back to the pre-storm condition, but if you have opportunity to enhance and improve on it, make it more resilient, HUD does allow for those additional resilient measures. So what comes up often is that you have a project where you have some additional resiliency features that FEMA found ineligible, And as long as your project met the other HUD, CDBG eligibility requirements, you had the, Davis-Bacon if you were involved, then you will be able to utilize the CDBG funds to pay that 25% match. So it's important to, put some thought into what projects you think are going to be big and long and ongoing, that you may want to have costs that would not normally be eligible by FEMA, and you can look towards the CDBG-DR to cover those costs. Again, the Federal Register notice will give you the specifics for each disaster allocation, so you'll need to look to that. And then again, the costs are drawn directly from HUD. They don't typically pre-approve your project. So once you have an action plan and you say, hey, we're going to do housing, we're going to put up to $100,000 in rehab, or we're going to rebuild roads in this particular county or town, then you go do those projects, and then HUD will come and you'll draw your funds down, and then HUD comes on a monitoring visit later on to see that you complied with all the requirements. So there's a risk there that you could spend funds ineligibly. So you always want to be cognizant of that. Okay, so we were talking about how you start to anticipate for receiving CDBG-DR, because it does lag after your FEMA and SBA and some other funding sources that come in. Okay, some pre-award steps. First and foremost, and this should complement some activities that you have going on immediately after your disaster with FEMA, is to do an unmet needs assessment. That means that you need to determine the extent of your disaster damage. And again, you're already looking to those type of damages in your FEMA assessment. After you've determined your extent of damage, then you need to be able to estimate as to what you can anticipate from all your federal funding sources. So what does it look like FEMA's going to pay on? What does it look like the FHWA and SBA and any other local or state sources for recovery? You need to factor that in. Then once you have a good sense of what your disaster damages are and what funding sources you have to address that, then you would calculate your unmet need. Once you have an unmet need, then you need to turn that in, or divide that into 3 categories. I'd want to see really your needs as a category of housing, your needs in infrastructure, and then your needs in economic revitalization. Some additional pre-award steps would be to identify the activities that you would need to address your unmet needs. So you can start looking to, while you're still waiting for the Federal Register to come out and some other direction from HUD, you do now know what your unmet need is, and then you can start aligning that need with what you know to be eligible CDBG-DR activities. If you're a direct grantee, you can take this unmet needs information and you'll use that to put into your action plan, and that'll be need to be sent to HUD for approval prior to getting your funding. If you are not a direct grantee, then you're probably going to be a sub-grantee in some form or fashion through the state. So it's good to start reaching out to the state, getting the understanding of where those funds are going, letting them know what your capabilities are. If you're an entitlement community, I think that's important for them to know, hey, I've been running HUD grants for 34 years. I understand a lot of this. Let's team up. Leverage that expertise that's in your regular community development department. And then if you're not a direct grantee, you've already done this assessment and you know what your funding needs are, it'll help the state more adequately fund you. So another important aspect of CDBG-DR, and what we're seeing in the Federal Register is even more in the more recent register notices, HUD is beefing up, assessing your capacity to run these grants. All right, so as you're looking to, now you know what your unmet need is, you know the type of generally where your housing need, or whether it's housing need, infrastructure, or some ratio of that, you'll want to start listing out programs and projects that you anticipate will need to be administered. Are you going to be administering a housing buyout program or a housing rehab program, or both? Once you understand whether you're doing housing, if you're doing bridges, are you doing parks, are you doing watersheds, then you want to look to what your current workload is and what kind of additional work capacity you're going to need to be able to handle even additional work in an area you're already familiar with, or creating new sectors. So you'll want to start assessing some of the skill sets of your staff. If you have housing programs that you want to implement, that's going to require taking in applications from applicants, being able to ask them for sensitive documentation, being able to interpret that documentation and see if it meets eligibility requirements. And then you need to be able to create and disperse grant awards with all of the appropriate HUD language in it. You'll need to be able to assess the repairs and so on and so forth for housing. So there can be several different areas that you need to look at what your internal capacity is. Same with infrastructure. With infrastructure, you really need to have people that are good with the federal procurement requirements. You need to know your Davis-Bacon and labor compliance. The environmental clearances can be tricky and long, so you want to make sure you've got someone that knows that really well, or that you bring on capacity to do that. With economic development, do you already have some kind of state loans that you're running? Because those departments may be helpful with either some type of policies and procedures that they're already using that you can modify, or people that they can loan you to help get your stuff going. So look into these different sectors within your government. Environmental review, again, absolutely critical. Any project that is funded but did not have proper environmental clearance will be determined ineligible by HUD. And then another area that is becoming very important to HUD recently is the data management. HUD has their own DR-GR system, their data management reporting system, and all information has to be that everything you're doing on site in your activities has to translate into the DR-GR system. So what I've seen, and we can talk more about best practices, is that if you can get an internal data management system that is already generating data in the format that HUD's looking to for their DR-GR, their reporting system, it just really creates efficiencies that are a tremendous benefit both on the state side, the local grantee side, and then HUD as well. And then HUD reimburses the communities for all eligible costs incurred while you're administering and delivering these grants. So while you are doing your unmet needs assessments and getting prepared to run HUD grants, keep track of that time, and then you, unless HUD changes their mind, but in every Federal Register notice they have been allowing these pre-activity award costs. So be sure to track that. Okay, so I wanted to go over some best practices. One of the best practices I've seen out there is early on to inform and prepare your decision makers and your stakeholders, because as we've discussed, FEMA and these other funding sources are fairly limited. So when your community hears and knows that they've got some CDBG-DR funds coming in, there's some big expectations for some big projects. And a lot of these can be accomplished. But what's important is that it takes a while. So you want to start participating with the public and informing them about the funds and getting their input into the type of projects they want to see in their communities, and be sure that you're documenting all of this consultation and outreach, because that'll play into when you do your action plan. But more importantly, it gives people an opportunity to understand the expectations on time. So be sure that you are doing that outreach, that you look for opportunities to form collaborative groups. As I've said, you've got, if you're an entitlement community or you've got an entitlement community within your county, you can look to them to help with this outreach, because this is something they do every year for their regular CDBG funds. So they may be a source there to help you with outreach and at ways that you can look to internal sources. You can combine sources. You can look for a high capacity lead agency. There's several opportunities to reach out and listen to your community and look for alternatives to implement what you need. So as Matt said in the introduction, I'm currently the project manager in the city of Longmont and working with what we call the Boulder County Collaborative. This is a new model that HUD came out to look at this past summer. In July, they were doing a monitoring for the state of Colorado for the CDBG-DR funds that they've received, and they were very interested in the collaborative model that was put together, and they wanted to assess it for the capacity, especially to help diverse groups and different sized communities come together and self-direct their recovery. And they were very impressed with what they saw, and they wrote up in their monitoring report the following. It says, HUD's review of housing programs included an overview of the Boulder County Collaborative, a local government organized effort wherein Boulder County's jurisdictions have joined together for their CDBG-DR funded disaster recovery efforts. The City of Longmont was designated the lead agency because of its experience in managing CDBG programs. All communities within the county impacted by the flood are welcome to join, and the collective also includes school, fire, and water districts that were identified in the unmet needs analysis. The local governments are linked by an intergovernmental agreement, and each jurisdiction's proportion of unmet need is the primary basis for determining the total CDBG-DR funds awarded to the jurisdiction. Communities may enter or leave the collaborative at the end of their respective project or when there is a new unmet needs analysis. The report went on to say, the collaborative appears to be a model method for units of local government to combine resources and identify a high-capacity lead agency to administer recovery programs on behalf of the collaborative participants. The City of Longmont's administration is strengthened by its adoption of a central grants management system using the Salesforce product platform as a part of a contract it has with Hagerty Consulting. The city's database includes key data on project status, monitoring efforts, and supporting documentation for draw requests. The system is also set up to be consistent with the DR-GR action plan and import data that can be pulled from DR-GR. HUD also recommended that the information on beneficiaries and individual infrastructure projects in the Central Grants Management System to help facilitate the review of the CDBG-DR funded recovery activities. So again, this was a new model, and we can speak more about it if you have questions, but the key to it was identifying a local government that already had over 30 years of managing CDBG-DR grants, organizing around them as a lead agency, reaching out countywide, and then putting together a countywide plan to address the individual community's recovery needs. So another best practice that's been quite successful is using these CDBG-DR funds as your local match. As I said, FEMA requires a match, FHA requires a match, and the way that you can use the CDBG-DR funds with your FEMA, for example, is as follows. We're going to use an example. Let's say you had 10 project worksheets, and each one had total damages of $100. So once FEMA goes in and obligates the funds and says, here's your eligible amount for the total damages, then they're actually only going to pay you that $75 on the $100. And then the local government will need to look to that other $25. And this is basically, what you would do. You would just go through, make sure that your project worksheet activities align with the eligible activities for the CDBG-DR, that they're meeting the national objective, and then you can look to matching those funds with your CDBG-DR funds. And you'd want to be sure that you account for that in your unmet needs assessment. So when you look to say FEMA's coming in with $300 million of assistance, then you know that you're going to have 25% of that's going to be an unmet need that you'll need to account for with your CDBG-DR. Okay, just a couple of final thoughts. Okay, some of the reality again of just federal disaster programs in general and how they differ from the CDBG-DR is that, for example, housing, whether you're using traditional FEMA or you're using the HUD CDBG-DR programs, and you have excellent activities, whether you're doing a buyout or you're doing repairs or replacement housing, you're never going to be able to get people back whole. And so that's just a fact. So, that's a good message that, people understand that this is to get them back on their feet, get them moving forward again in their lives, but you can't put them back to where they were before the disaster, and that's a reality. When it comes to business recovery, SBA is basically the funding source out there that businesses can go to, and that's not always an attractive option. So with the CDBG-DR, you can fill some of those gaps that's not addressed through the SBA. After these disasters, infrastructures are hit hard, and infrastructure are very costly activities. Even there is no small road project. So it is good to have this source of funding. The CDBG-DR can come in and pay that match, which can be considerable. 25% of $1 million project is a big hit to a small community. So that's a reality there. Resilience is important, and it's becoming more required through different federal programs. And with FEMA PA still, you're not able to build back with a lot of resilience. Those resiliency costs are found ineligible. But with your CDBG-DR, you can cover those additional resiliency features if you get them environmentally cleared and make sure they're an eligible activity that meet a national objective. Then you can pay for those resiliency features with your CDBG-DR. Okay, final thoughts. Again, as kind of go over, we want to make sure that you understand immediately after the disaster, which you're already on this, look out there, identify and quantify your recovery needs, and be sure that you account for that by sector: housing, infrastructure, and economic and business. Be sure to assess your current staff capacity as soon as possible. Once you've identified those needs, if you realize, oh my gosh, we need to do a lot of recovery in housing, we haven't really have that many people that work with housing, so that's going to be an area. Or if it's a lot with infrastructure, and you've got a great source of infrastructure in-house staff, then you've been able to make that assessment. So you want to look at your current staff capacity, and you do want to identify your additional needs. Look out there at the best practices. What's changed. The way things are being done under Katrina is vastly different from how it's been done under Sandy. And then from Sandy, it's changed quite a bit to what's come out under the Matthew. So there's a lot, you need to look out there and see what's going on. You want to be thoughtful, you want to be strategic, and you want to be tactical in your actions. Make sure you're getting what you need to address your community-specific needs. Ensure that your data management system is comprehensive and aligns with HUD. That is a huge best practice that I strongly recommend. And then you can reach out to us if you have any issues or questions.
So Deb, I think that concludes your presentation. We have just as a reminder to the audience, we are not utilizing the phone for questions. So if you do have any, as some of you have already done, please use the question box in your toolbar on the right-hand side. But we do have quite a few questions that we thought that there may be given this topic. Deb, I've tried to organize them in terms of topic area, but I'll read them to you, and we can go through them with the time that we have remaining, if that works.
That sounds great. Thanks, Matt.
There are two related to disaster declarations, and so I'll break them up into one and two parts. And the first one is, are CDBG-DR funds available in disasters that are not federally declared, or is this only for presidentially declared disasters? And then the second part to that would be, do the projects have to be tied directly to the aftermath damage from that disaster?
It is for only presidentially declared disasters. However, HUD can always make exceptions, and so, for example, if they're sending funds for example, here in Colorado, they were putting out funds for the flood that happened in 2013, but there had been some fires previous to that didn't rise to the level of getting this assistance. So when they did put the federal declaration out, the Federal Register out, they included a couple of those areas that had fire impacts. So you'll just need to look to the Federal Register notice. But again, I do want to remind you that there are communities that get annual CDBG allocations, and urgent need is always a category, a national objective to be met. So if you have that source in your community, you may be able to look to them for some immediate assistance, and those funds too can be used as matching for your PA. So just wanted to remind you of that. For the second part, yes, you have to show a tie back to the aftermath of the disaster for the purposes of recovery, but you can also look to resiliency and for pre-planning for your pre- and post-disaster hazard mitigation. And I just want to bring up that in the last Federal Register notice, and this is the first time I had seen it, HUD actually put a specific requirement in there to meet the action plan requirements. They wanted to see a response in the plan for a long-term recovery and pre- and post-disaster hazard mitigation. So if you don't have those plans in place, that is something that HUD will pay for now out of your DR funds, and is requiring that you have these type of pre- and post-disaster plans in place. So those would be things maybe not directly tied, so that's in your pre- and post planning and resiliency. But other than that, you will need to have some kind of documentation that ties it back to an actual impact or an inadvertent impact.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Go ahead. Next question. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Sure. The next one is around unmet needs. What is the time frame for identifying unmet needs? It has been our experience that long-term recovery committees may not identify some unmet needs until over a year later as more survivors come forward.
That's a good question. So again, all you can do is a point in time, and as soon as you can start assessing those unmet needs, especially by sector after your disaster impact, the better. But what I do want to let you know is that you can change it. So once you've done your action plan and you're moving forward, and then as you said, all of a sudden you find, oh my gosh, we didn't even know about all these people that had really serious flooding. We're going to need some additional housing funds. Then you can always amend your action plan. So depending on what HUD puts in the Federal Register notice, it may be a substantial amendment, and then you may have some additional steps, or it may just be a technical amendment and moving money around within a sector. But HUD will have guidance on that.
Okay, great. Okay. Since we're still in sort of the administrative portion of the questions, there's one: can regular CDBG funds be used as local match?
Always check with your local HUD rep to make sure they have the same interpretation, but that is actually allowed under the Housing and Community Development Act that created the CDBG to begin with. So it's typically allowed to be used as match, but always double check with your local rep.
Okay, great. This is one, Deb, I think you'll enjoy answering. Please discuss how the lead agency, the City of Longmont, ensured integration with the local disaster recovery team.
Okay. So the City of Longmont, you know, they have their emergency management department, and they were very active. They were already collaborating with Boulder County. Boulder County does, you know, look for opportunities to collaborate in just other areas in general. So we immediately, you know, in starting our unmet needs assessment, went to the disaster managers through the communities to start our outreach to them. Can you say that question just one more time? I want to make sure I hit all the aspects.
Sure. Please discuss how the lead agency, the City of Longmont, ensured integration with the local disaster recovery team.
Yeah, and we still depend on them a lot. So we're doing for all the communities, they are taking advantage of that FEMA PA match, and so we work with the emergency management to reach out to them if we see that, you know, an obligation is being held up, or that you know, changes are still pending, or they'll review something that's being submitted. And so Longmont, you know, started there by reaching out to their emergency management team, and again, we just, through emergency managers and the different local government officials, they you know, just begin to coordinate. And so they built on what they had already started in coordination during the FEMA recovery aspects.
Okay, great. So another one related to systems and databases. I saw infrastructure is covered. You mentioned DR-GR systems. Is there a collaboration type of agreement we, the government, can work on building our database to populate that system, to access and submit requests for consideration for support through CDBG-DR?
Okay, I'm going to let you read that one more time. It's a great question.
I saw infrastructure is covered. You mentioned DR-GR systems. Is there a collaboration type of agreement we, the government, can work on building our database to populate that system, to access and submit requests for consideration for support through CDBG-DR?
Okay, so if I heard correctly, at this point, there's not a way to submit requests for support through the system. The way we've been implementing the data management and support in alignment with HUD is that once the allocation comes out, and in this case, let's say Boulder County Collaborative, once they'd come up with their action plans and they knew what types of activities they were going to fund and what the funding limits were, then we built an internal system for the collaborative, and so all of the partners have their own project page within the system, but all the project, so they only see their own project page, but then of course Longmont is the lead agency, sees all of them to keep it all tied together, and it all funnels in. So what happens is that once you do that, then you immediately set your data management system up internally with a workflow and process system that mirrors how you have put your projects in the action plan. And then that also mirrors DR-GR, because HUD requires that you take your action plan and put it into their data management system with certain reporting elements. So when you build in this case, we use the Salesforce platform. That system had those same key components, that data fields that can be pulled into a report. So there's what we call the QPR, the quarterly report to HUD, on your DR/GR funds, and you have to go through what you've expended your funds on, what you plan to expend the funds on, where you are, and meeting all these different objectives. And if you, when you're processing your projects in the system, if these elements are called out, as well as budgeting and the financing, and just we go, there's even the procurement. So everything is pre-checked as it's being put into the system, and then a report can pull off of these data elements that align with the reporting that HUD wants to see.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. I think we've got time for a couple more. I think I understand this one, but I'll ask Deb and we can talk through it. Do you have a financial revenue / economic disaster related funding opportunities portfolio I can get to provide my director and secretary of the department? I'm assuming that's getting at the Federal Register, but I wanted to throw that to you, Deb.
Just repeat that one more time, please, Matt.
Sure. Do you have a financial revenue, economic, disaster-related funding opportunities portfolio I can get to provide my director or secretary of the department?
Yeah, again, as you said, the funding opportunities for any kind of economic development will be listed out in the Federal Register. So it would depend on, for example, under Sandy, HUD really put an emphasis on certain small business criteria, and you had to meet that criteria for the business you were going to fund. That can change in the next Federal Register notice. So you'll want to look to that for what the funding opportunities would be under the economic development for CDBG-DR. Again, if you have a entitlement community that you have access to, they may be doing something with their CDBG that could, assist with the economic development piece of it, because that's always an eligible activity under even regular CDBG.
And Deb, does HUD keep the Federal Registers on their website?
Yes, they do.
Excellent. Okay, I think we've got time for one more. How does HUD consider buyouts in its objectives for housing?
So when you're doing a buyout, you can do it under a couple of different approaches. You can meet the low mod objective, which you always want to try to do because there is that percentage requirement. And then once you through that, you can do it on an area benefit. So let's say that per your census tract, and this is data too that you can get off the HUD website. You can go there to find out HUD's own determination of whether a community's at a certain percent of what they call low mod in the area. And so any census tract that shows 51% low mod per HUD data, then you can do an area benefit. So if you have, a couple of blocks or several blocks of homes that you want to do in a buyout, and that census tract data shows that it meets the low mod criteria, you could do it on an area benefit. You can also do it under individual households. So you can get the income and determine household by household. And because you're paying the pre-storm value in a buyout, that the difference between the post-disaster and pre-disaster value is considered a benefit, so you are directly benefiting low-mod households. So that's another way to do it. And then you can also meet a national objective under urgent need. So if it's within 2 years after the disaster and you get this program going, then you meet that urgent need national objective through a buyout program.
But obviously, thank you for joining us today for the NEMA webinar series, and thank you to Deb for sharing your experiences and obviously your deep expertise in the topic. The next webinar is scheduled for April 5th on the topic of integrating unmanned aerial systems into disaster response. And registration for that will open in March. Again, I wanted to thank Deb Siefert for putting the presentation together and walking us through all of that. And thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.